The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Ketharan. The temple complex stretched for miles across the desert planet of Axiom 7, its crystal spires reaching toward the pale sky like fingers of frozen light. For 10,000 years, pilgrims had traveled here from every corner of the galaxy. They came seeking something that most would never find. At the heart of the temple stood the gates, two massive barriers of pure crystal, each 100 feet tall and 50 feet wide. They had no hinges, no visible mechanism, no control panel. They simply existed, sealed tight, waiting. The surface of each gate shimmered with inner light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Ancient writing covered their surface in languages so old that even the temple keepers could only guess at their meaning. The Zephyrian priests moved through their daily routines with practiced calm. They had tended this place for centuries, watching as beings from across the galaxy came to test themselves against the gates. The priests wore simple white robes that seemed to glow in the desert heat. Their faces were long and narrow, with large dark eyes that had seen countless dreams shatter against the crystal barriers. High Keeper Veltar stood on the temple steps, watching the latest group of pilgrims gather in the courtyard below. A Krex general in golden armor paced back and forth, his massive frame casting a shadow like a walking mountain. Beside him, 3 ethereal philosophers floated in meditation poses, their translucent bodies barely visible in the bright sunlight. A group of Vorthon merchants had paid enormous sums for the chance to attempt the gates, their jeweled clothing marking them as among the richest beings in known space. Another day, another group of hopefuls, muttered Keeper Xanath as he approached Veltar. His voice carried the weight of centuries spent watching failure. The Krex general has conquered 12 star systems. The Ethereals claim they have unlocked the secrets of time itself. The Vorthons own half the trading routes in the spiral arm. Veltar nodded slowly, and yet the gates remain closed, as they have for the last 300 years. He gestured toward the crystal barriers. Tell me, Xanath, what do you think the ancestors intended? What quality did they seek in those who would pass through? The younger keeper shrugged. Power, perhaps. Great deeds. Achievement beyond measure. He paused, watching as the Krex general drew his ceremonial sword and began a series of complex battle forms. Though if that were true, surely someone would have succeeded by now. Far from the temple, in a rocky valley 15 kilometers away, Dr. Sarah Chen crawled out of her small research tent and stretched in the morning air. She was a small woman in her 30s with short black hair that stuck up at odd angles and clothes that had seen better days. Her face was already smudged with dust, and she had been on Axiom 7 for only 3 hours. Coffee first, then work, she muttered to herself, fumbling with a portable brewing device. Sarah was a xenoarchaeologist, part of a small survey team documenting pre-spaceflight civilizations. She had studied the Zephyrian culture for years, but only from ancient ruins on dead worlds. This was her first chance to see a living Zephyrian site. Her team leader, Dr. Martinez, emerged from the command tent with a tablet in his hands. Chen, we need those mineral surveys completed by tomorrow. The transport won't wait and we're already behind schedule. Sarah nodded, still focused on her coffee. No problem. The geological formations here are fascinating. I'm picking up some unusual readings about 15 clicks north. Might be worth a look. Just stay in radio contact, Martinez warned. This planet has some weird stories about it. Local legends and such. Sarah waved him off. She had heard the stories during the flight here. Ancient temples, mystical gates, pilgrims seeking something called legendary resonance. Tourist nonsense in her opinion. She was interested in rocks, mineral formations, and the geological history that shaped civilizations. Myths were for anthropologists. Back at the temple, the first pilgrim approached the gates. The Krex general stepped forward with ceremony, his golden armor gleaming. The gathered crowd fell silent. Even the desert wind seemed to pause. The general raised his massive arms and spoke in a voice that carried. Across the courtyard, I am General Thrackmore of the 7th Fleet. I have conquered the Outer Rim. I have led 1,000,000 soldiers to victory. I have brought peace to 12 worlds through strength. His words echoed off the crystal spires. I have earned the right to pass. The gates remained closed. Not even a flicker of response from their inner light. Thrackmore stood there for a long moment, his massive frame trembling with suppressed emotion. He had spent 40 years earning this chance. 40 years of battle, of sacrifice, of building a legend that stretched across the galaxy. The silence from the gates was louder than any weapon's roar. One by one, the other pilgrims tried. The ethereal philosophers spoke of wisdom transcendent, of knowledge that spanned dimensions. The Vorthan merchants spoke of wealth that could feed entire worlds, of economic power that shaped the fate of systems. Each time the gates remained unmoved, Keeper Veltar watched with sad eyes. This scene played out month after month, year after year. The greatest beings in the galaxy came here seeking validation, seeking proof that their achievements meant something beyond the material world. Most left disappointed. Some never left at all, spending their remaining years in the desert town below the temple, studying the gates and searching for answers that might not exist. Sarah finished her coffee and shouldered her equipment pack. The unusual readings were definitely worth investigating. Her scanner showed mineral compositions that didn't match any known formation. She set off across the rocky desert, humming an old Earth song under her breath. The walk was pleasant despite the heat. Sarah had grown up in desert regions of Earth and felt comfortable under the blazing sun. She paused every few hundred meters to take readings, document interesting rock formations, and collect samples. This was her favorite part of the job, the quiet work of understanding how planets shaped the civilizations that lived on them. As she crested a small ridge, she saw the temple complex spread out below her. Her breath caught in her throat. The photographs had not done it justice. The crystal spires rose like a forest of light, and even from this distance she could see the massive gates at the complex's heart. Now that's impressive, she said to herself, raising her camera. The engineering alone must have been incredible. She zoomed in with her scanner, taking detailed readings of the crystal structures. The mineral composition was unlike anything in her database. Some kind of exotic matter, perhaps, or crystal grown through techniques lost to time. Her scientist's mind raced with questions about construction methods, material properties, and the geological processes that could have created such formations. Sarah began walking toward the temple, still focused on her readings. She barely noticed the groups of beings gathered in the courtyard. Her scanner was picking up increasingly strange readings as she approached. Energy patterns that seemed to pulse with life, electromagnetic signatures that defied explanation. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the whispered conversations among the pilgrims as she passed. She didn't see the Zephyrian keepers watching her with curious eyes. She certainly didn't notice the way the gates seemed to pulse brighter as she approached, their inner light responding to something that no one, not even Sarah herself, could understand. All she saw were fascinating mineral formations and the chance to unlock secrets written in stone and crystal. To Sarah Chen, the Temple of Ketharan was not a sacred site or a test of worthiness. It was simply the most interesting geological formation she had ever encountered. Sarah walked through the temple courtyard like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn. Her eyes were fixed on her scanner, which was practically humming with excitement. The readings were off the charts. The crystal formations here showed energy patterns she had never seen before, electromagnetic fields that pulsed in perfect rhythm, mineral compositions that seemed to shift and change as she watched. Incredible, she muttered, adjusting her scanner settings. The lattice structure is completely stable, but the energy output suggests active molecular processes. How is that possible? The pilgrim stared at her. The Krex general, still standing before the gates after his failed attempt, watched this small human walk past him without a glance. She wore simple field clothes, dusty pants, a worn shirt, and boots that had seen too many rocky planets. Her hair was messy, her face focused on the small device in her hands. She looked like exactly what she was, a working scientist on a routine survey mission. Keeper Veltar descended the temple steps, approaching the strange human. "Excuse me," he said in careful standard Galactic. "This is a sacred site. Are you here for the pilgrimage?" Sarah looked up from her scanner, blinking in the bright sunlight. "Pilgrimage? Oh no, I'm just doing a mineral survey. Dr. Sarah Chen, Xenoarchaeology." She gestured vaguely at the massive crystal structures around them. "This is fascinating work you have here. The engineering must have taken centuries. Mind if I ask about the construction techniques?" The keeper stared at her. In 300 years of tending the temple, he had never met anyone who looked at the gates and asked about construction techniques. "These are the gates of legend," he said slowly. They open only for those who have achieved mythical status through great deeds. Sarah said, already turning back to her scanner. That's nice. The energy readings here are really unusual. Are you getting seismic activity? Because my instruments are showing some kind of resonance pattern. She walked closer to the gates, holding her scanner out in front of her. The device was beeping rapidly now, its screen filled with data that made Sarah's heart race. This was the kind of discovery that could revolutionize their understanding of exotic matter interactions. "Ma'am," Keeper Xanath called out, hurrying after her. "Please maintain a respectful distance from the gates. Many have stood here and been found wanting." Sarah barely heard him. She was now just 10 feet from the crystal barriers and her scanner was going wild. The readings showed energy patterns that seemed almost alive. The gates pulsed with inner light that matched the rhythm of some cosmic heartbeat. She raised her scanner higher, trying to get better readings of the upper sections. "The electromagnetic field density is incredible," she said to herself, taking a step closer. "And the harmonic frequencies. It's like the entire structure is singing." The pilgrims watched in growing amazement as this oblivious human approached the gates with all the reverence of someone examining an interesting rock. General Thrackmore had spent decades preparing for this moment. The ethereal philosophers had meditated for centuries on the nature of legend and achievement. The Vorthon merchants had paid fortunes for the privilege of standing where Sarah now walked casually. "Someone should stop her," whispered one of the ethereals. "The gates do not suffer mockery well." But Keeper Veltar held up a hand. Something was happening. The gates were responding. The inner light was growing brighter, pulsing faster. In 3 centuries, he had never seen them react to mere proximity. Sarah took another step forward, now just 5 feet from the massive crystal barriers. Her scanner was practically screaming with data. She adjusted the settings, trying to understand what she was seeing. The energy patterns were unlike anything in the scientific literature. This could be her life's work, the discovery that would rewrite textbooks across the galaxy. "The molecular resonance is off the charts," she muttered, completely absorbed in her readings. "And the energy output suggests some kind of self-sustaining reaction. But what's the power source?" She stepped forward again, now close enough to touch the gates. The crystal surface was smooth as glass, warm to the touch, humming with barely contained energy. Sarah reached out with one hand while holding her scanner with the other, intent on getting direct contact readings. The moment her fingers touched the crystal, everything changed. Light exploded from the gates like a small sun being born. Crystal barriers rang like enormous bells, their song echoing across the desert and up into the clear sky. The ground trembled. The air itself seemed to sing, and slowly, impossibly, the gates began to open. The massive crystal barriers swung inward on hinges that no one could see. Light poured from the opening like liquid gold. The singing grew louder, a harmony of crystal voices that spoke of age and wisdom and secrets older than civilizations. Sarah stumbled backward, her scanner forgotten in her hand. "What the hell?" she gasped. The pilgrims stood frozen in shock. The Zephyrian keepers fell to their knees. General Thrackmore's jaw hung open beneath his battle helmet. In 10,000 years of temple history, the gates had opened perhaps a dozen times. In the last 3 centuries, they had remained stubbornly closed, and now they stood wide for a human who had been trying to take mineral readings. "This is impossible," Keeper Veltar whispered. "She seeks no legend. She claims no great deeds. She doesn't even understand what she has done." Sarah stared at the opening gates, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The interior was filled with soft light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She could see crystal formations floating in midair, defying gravity. The space inside looked bigger than the gates themselves, which violated basic geometry. "Okay," she said to herself, raising her scanner again. "This is definitely not in the textbooks." The scanner readings were beyond unusual now. They were physically impossible. Energy patterns that folded space, matter that existed in quantum superposition, gravitational fields that pointed in directions that didn't exist. Sarah's scientific training warred with the evidence of her eyes. "I should go back to camp," she said aloud. "Report this to Dr. Martinez. Get a full survey team out here." But even as she spoke, she was walking forward. The scientist in her could not resist the greatest discovery in galactic history. The readings beyond those gates could revolutionize physics. They could unlock secrets of matter and energy that civilizations had been seeking for millennia. She stepped through the opening. The gates slammed shut behind her with finality that rang like a funeral bell. The light dimmed. The singing stopped. The crystal barriers returned to their normal glow, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. In the courtyard, chaos erupted. The pilgrims shouted in a dozen languages. The keepers ran in circles, checking ancient instruments and consulting scrolls that had gathered dust for centuries. General Thrackmore stood staring at the closed gates, his 40 years of preparation rendered meaningless by a human who had walked through by accident. "Send word to the council," Keeper Veltar commanded, his voice shaking. "Send word to every world, every government, every academic institution. A human has passed through the gates of legend." "What do we tell them?" asked Keeper Zaneth. "That the greatest mystery in the galaxy was solved by someone taking mineral readings." Veltar looked at the sealed gates, still trying to understand what he had witnessed. "Tell them the truth. Tell them that legends are not what we thought they were. Tell them that a human woman walked through the gates while complaining about electromagnetic interference." In the silence that followed, one thought echoed in every mind present. If Sarah Chen was legendary, what did that say about the rest of humanity? The desert wind resumed its eternal song, but now it carried whispers of change across the galaxy. The Temple of Ketharan had revealed its greatest secret, and the secret had been hiding in plain sight all along. Behind the sealed gates, Sarah Chen continued her survey, unaware that she had just shattered 10,000 years of galactic assumptions about the nature of legend itself. Sarah stood in a space that broke every law of physics she knew. The chamber beyond the gates stretched impossibly far in all directions. Crystal formations floated in midair like frozen fireworks, each one pulsing with soft light. The walls curved away into misty distance, and the ceiling disappeared into star-filled darkness that seemed to contain actual constellations. "Okay," she said to her scanner, as if the device could provide answers to impossible questions. "Interior space exceeds exterior dimensions by at least a factor of 10. Gravitational fields are inconsistent with planetary norms, and those are definitely stars in the ceiling, which makes no sense at all." Her voice echoed strangely in the vast space, as if the chamber were both enormous and intimate at the same time. Sarah walked forward carefully, testing each step. The floor felt solid enough, made of the same crystal material as the gates, but it was warm under her feet and seemed to pulse with life. The floating crystal formations responded to her presence. As she passed beneath them, they chimed softly, their light growing brighter. Sarah held up her scanner, recording everything. This discovery would revolutionize physics, archaeology, and probably half a dozen other fields she hadn't thought of yet. "The energy patterns are completely stable," she muttered, documenting her observations. "No power source visible, but the harmonics suggest some kind of self-sustaining reaction. Possibly zero-point energy manipulation, but that's supposed to be theoretical." As she moved deeper into the chamber, the crystals began to sing. Not the simple chimes she had heard before, but complex harmonies that seemed to carry meaning. Sarah paused, listening. Her scanner showed that the sounds were creating interference patterns in the air itself, somehow encoding information in pure acoustics. "It's like they're trying to communicate," she said wonderingly. The chamber responded to her words. The singing grew louder, more complex. The floating crystals began to move, forming patterns around her. Light flowed between them like liquid electricity, and suddenly, Sarah was no longer alone in the vast space. Images appeared in the air around her, not solid but clear as memories. She saw a hospital room on Earth during some ancient plague. A nurse moved between beds of dying patients, her face covered with a simple mask, her hands gentle as she cared for people that everyone else had abandoned. The woman was young, maybe 25, with tired eyes and determined movements. "I don't understand," Sarah said to the empty air. "What does this have to do with me?" The image shifted. Now she saw a school in a war zone. Buildings burned in the distance and the sound of weapons filled the air. But inside one small classroom, a teacher continued to read to her students. She was clearly terrified, her hands shaking as she turned the pages, but she kept reading until the last child was safely evacuated. More images followed. A firefighter running into a collapsing building while everyone else ran out. A scientist in a shabby laboratory, working 18-hour days to develop a medicine she would never be able to afford herself. A farmer sharing his last harvest with refugees, knowing his own family would go hungry. These are all humans, Sarah realized. But I don't know any of these people. Why are you showing me this? The chamber's response was overwhelming. Thousands of images filled the air around her, each one showing a human doing something impossible for the simple reason that it needed to be done. A mother carrying wounded children through a blizzard. A mechanic fixing water pumps in a refugee camp without payment. A teacher in a remote village walking 20 miles each day to reach her students. And then Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. It was her grandmother, Maria, during the War of 2387. Sarah had heard the stories, but seeing it was different. Maria was hiding 12 refugee families in her basement, while enemy soldiers searched house by house. The old woman sat calmly at her kitchen table, serving tea to the officers and chatting about the weather while families crouched silently below her feet. Abuela, Sarah whispered. But how do you know about her? The images shifted again. Now she saw her father, working 2 jobs to keep a community clinic open after the government funding was cut. She watched him fall asleep at his desk night after night, exhausted but determined that his neighbors would have medical care. She saw herself at 8 years old, bringing him coffee and studying her homework beside him in the empty clinic. This is my family, Sarah said, her voice shaking. These are my memories, but the chamber wasn't finished. New images appeared and Sarah gasped as she recognized herself. But these weren't her memories. These were scenes from other perspectives, moments she had lived but never seen from the outside. She watched herself at university, giving her last 20 credits to a classmate who couldn't afford textbooks. She saw herself on Kepler 442, working for 3 days straight to document a dying civilization's art before corporate miners destroyed the site. She watched herself choose xenoarchaeology over the lucrative corporate geology position her advisor had recommended. I was just doing my job, Sarah protested to the swirling images. None of this is special. The chamber responded with what felt like gentle laughter. The crystals chimed in harmony that sounded almost amused. New images appeared, showing her moments Sarah had completely forgotten. Times when she had stayed late to help struggling students. The paper she had written that saved an ancient monument from demolition. The time she had walked 6 miles in a storm to check on an elderly neighbor. These are just normal things, Sarah insisted. Anyone would have done the same. The chamber's response was immediate and powerful. Images flashed around her showing other species, other cultures, other ways of thinking. She saw Krex warriors who valued honor above all else, but only within their own clans. Ethereal philosophers who sought wisdom but hoarded it jealously. Vorthan merchants who accumulated wealth while others starved. And then she saw something that made her sink to her knees in wonder. The chamber showed her Earth from space, but not as she had ever seen it before. Every human on the planet glowed with soft light, billions of points of illumination in the darkness. The light pulsed in rhythm like a planetary heartbeat, and around each point of light, Sarah could see tiny threads of connection reaching out to other lights. Every act of kindness created a thread. Every moment of sacrifice strengthened the connection. Every time a human did something difficult simply because it was right, the network grew brighter. We're all connected, Sarah breathed. Every human is part of something larger. The images around her shifted one final time. Now she saw the truth that the chamber had been trying to show her. Every human who had ever lived carried the potential for legend, not as a goal but as a natural response to need. They didn't seek to become myths through grand gestures. They became legendary by being stubbornly, impossibly human. She saw a construction worker who noticed a crack in a building and spent his weekend fixing it for free. A janitor who learned 3 languages so she could help the immigrant families in her neighborhood. A programmer who wrote software to help people navigate emergency evacuations, then released it for free. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they were needed. Sarah finally understood what the chamber was telling her. Humans weren't legends despite their ordinariness. They were legends because of it. Every human carried the seed of mythic action, not as a conscious choice but as a simple fact of their nature. But I'm just an archaeologist, she said weakly. The chamber responded by showing her own reflection, but not as she saw herself. In the crystal's image, Sarah glowed with the same soft light she had seen around every human on Earth. Her light was steady and warm, connected by countless threads to other lights across the galaxy. She was part of the network, part of the impossible web of casual heroism that humanity had been weaving since they first learned to care for each other. The revelation was so overwhelming that Sarah sat down hard on the crystal floor. She wasn't in the chamber because she had achieved something great. She was here because she was human, and being human meant carrying the capacity for legend without even realizing it. Around her, the floating crystals continued their gentle song, welcoming her to a truth that would soon shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The temple gates had not made a mistake. They had finally found what they were looking for, a legend who didn't know she was legendary. Outside the sealed gates, representatives from every major galactic government were already traveling toward Axiom 7. The impossible had happened, and they needed to understand why. The news traveled faster than light across the galaxy. Within hours of Sarah's disappearance into the gates, every major news network was broadcasting the impossible story. A human had achieved what the greatest heroes in galactic history could not. The implications were staggering. On the Krex homeworld of Veltar, General Thrakmor sat in his war room surrounded by scrolls and data tablets. He had returned from Axiom 7 3 days ago, but sleep would not come. 40 years of military achievement, 12 conquered star systems, 1 million soldiers who called him legend, and a small human woman with a scanner had walked past him like he was invisible. "Research everything," he commanded his aide, a young Krex warrior named Belthar. "I want to know about humans. I want to know their history, their culture, their greatest achievements. I want to know what makes them legendary." Belthar bowed and activated the data screens. Within minutes, human history began to unfold before them. The Krex were a warrior culture, so they looked first for military achievements. What they found confused them. "Sir," Belthar said slowly, "their military records are unusual. They fight wars they cannot win. They sacrifice themselves for people they have never met. Look at this battle report from their Second World War." The screen showed footage from Earth's ancient conflicts. Soldiers throwing themselves on grenades to save their comrades. Medics running into gunfire to rescue the wounded. Pilots crashing their damaged aircraft away from populated areas rather than ejecting to safety. "They die for others," Thrakmor muttered. "But where is the glory? Where is the conquest?" "That's not the strangest part, sir," Belthar continued. "Look at what they do after their wars end. They rebuild their enemies' cities. They send food and medicine to people who were trying to kill them months before. They write rules to make war more humane." Thrakmor stared at the data. "In Krex culture, you defeated your enemies completely or you were defeated by them. There was no middle ground, no mercy, no rebuilding. The idea of helping a defeated foe was not just foreign, it was incomprehensible." "Show me more," he ordered. On the ethereal homeworld of Luxandra, the Council of Minds had convened an emergency session. The ethereals were beings of pure thought, having transcended physical form millennia ago. They prided themselves on wisdom and understanding that spanned dimensions. The human success at the gates challenged everything they believed about achievement and enlightenment. Wise mind Torvalen floated in the center of the crystal chamber, his translucent form flickering with thought patterns. Around him, dozens of other ethereals shared data through direct mental connection. They had studied human philosophy for the past 72 hours and the results were disturbing. "Their greatest thinkers are contradictions," Torvalen announced to the assembly. "They speak of wisdom gained through suffering, of strength found in admitting weakness, of victory achieved through surrender. Their philosophy makes no logical sense." Another ethereal, Zendara, pulsed with confused light patterns. "I have analyzed their educational systems. They teach their children to question authority, including their own teachers. They encourage doubt and disagreement. How can wisdom grow in such chaos?" "Look at this human called Gandhi," offered Velnara, sharing images directly into the collective consciousness. "He achieved political victory through deliberate weakness. He won wars by refusing to fight. By our standards, his methods should have failed completely." The assembly buzzed with confusion. Ethereal society was built on the pursuit of perfect knowledge and absolute truth. Their wise minds spent centuries in meditation, achieving clarity through careful thought and logical progression. Humans seem to stumble toward wisdom through random acts of apparent foolishness. Yet their methods work, Torvalen admitted reluctantly. This Gandhi freed his people from an empire that ruled half their world. This human called king changed their society through speeches and peaceful protest. They achieved the impossible through means we would never consider. In the Vorthan Commercial League, Chairman Hexnar reviewed economic reports about human trade practices with growing bewilderment. The Vorthans had built the largest commercial empire in the galaxy through careful calculation, strategic resource hoarding, and profitable exploitation of economic advantages. Human economics defied all their principles. They give things away, his analyst reported in disbelief. Medicines, technologies, even food. They develop cures for diseases and then share the formulas for free. They built a communication network that spans their entire world and let everyone use it without payment. Hexnar's four eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of extreme confusion among his species. But how do they profit? How do they maintain economic advantage? They don't seem to care about economic advantage, sir. Look at this human called Salk. He developed a cure for a disease that was killing their children. When asked who owned the patent, he said, "Could you patent the sun?" He gave it away to everyone. The chairman's corporate mind reeled. That cure could have made him the richest being on his planet. He could have owned entire governments through monopoly control. Why would he simply give it away? The records suggest he thought saving children was more important than making money, sir. Hexnar sat in silence for a long moment. In Vorthon culture, everything had a price. Everything could be bought, sold, or traded for advantage. The idea of giving away something valuable simply because others needed it was beyond his comprehension. Back on Axiom 7, Keeper Veltar stood before the ancient archives of memory, deep beneath the temple complex. These crystal formations held the complete history of the gates, including records of every being who had ever attempted passage. He was searching for answers in 10,000 years of accumulated data. "Show me the nature of legend," he commanded the archive crystals. The response filled the chamber with light. Images of the 12 beings who had successfully passed through the gates appeared in the air around him. Each one had been a figure of immense achievement, conquerors who had united entire sectors, philosophers who had unlocked the secrets of reality itself, artists whose works had inspired entire civilizations. But as Veltar studied the records more carefully, he began to see a pattern that had been hidden for millennia. Each successful candidate had achieved their legendary status through actions that seemed to contradict their own interests. The conqueror who had given up his empire to save a dying species. The philosopher who had shared her deepest insights freely, knowing others would claim credit. The artist who had anonymously donated his masterpieces to bring beauty to the poorest worlds. They became legends by acting against legend, Veltar whispered in realization. The archive responded by showing him something that changed everything, the original programming of the gates, hidden in the deepest memory crystals. The ancient Zephyrian architects had not built the gates to recognize achievement or power, or even great deeds. They had built them to recognize a specific quality, the willingness to do what was right when it cost everything and gained nothing. Most beings pursued legend consciously. They sought to become myths through grand gestures and world-shaking accomplishments. But the gates were designed to open only for those who performed legendary acts without seeking legendary status. The archives showed him humanity's history, and Veltar finally understood what made them unique. Every human carried the potential for this unconscious heroism. They didn't need to achieve great things to become legendary. They were legendary because they consistently did impossible things simply because those things needed doing. Human firefighter who ran into burning buildings wasn't trying to become a legend. He was just doing his job. A human teacher who spent her own money on supplies for poor students wasn't seeking fame. She was just trying to help. A human scientist who worked for decades on problems that might never be solved wasn't pursuing glory. She was just curious about the universe. They are legends without trying to be legends, Veltar said aloud. That's what the gates were waiting for. Not the achievement of legendary status, but the essence of legendary action performed unconsciously. The revelation shattered everything the galaxy thought it knew about greatness and achievement. Humans weren't special because they had accomplished great things. They were special because they accomplished great things accidentally, as a side effect of simply being themselves. As word spread across the galaxy, governments and institutions began studying humanity with new eyes. The species that had been dismissed as young and inexperienced suddenly became the subject of intense academic focus. Everyone wanted to understand the human secret, how an entire species could be legendary without realizing it. But as scientists and philosophers struggled to decode human nature, Sarah Chen remained trapped in the crystal chamber, still convinced she was just taking mineral readings of an unusually interesting geological formation. Sarah had been in the crystal chamber for what felt like hours, though her watch had stopped working the moment she stepped through the gates. The floating formations continued their gentle song, and she had filled 3 memory cards with the most impossible scientific data in galactic history. Her excitement was tempered by growing concern about getting back to her survey team. "This is incredible research," she said to herself, checking her equipment one more time. "But Martinez is going to kill me if I miss the transport. And I still haven't figured out how to open these gates from the inside." The chamber seemed to respond to her words. The crystals chimed more urgently, and the star-filled ceiling began to pulse with new patterns. Sarah looked up and gasped as the darkness above her transformed into a view of the temple courtyard outside. The scene that greeted her was unlike anything she had expected. The modest gathering of pilgrims had been replaced by a massive crowd. Ships filled the sky like metallic clouds, and beings from dozens of species crowded the ancient stones. News crews, government officials, academic delegations, and curious tourists all pressed against security barriers that had been hastily erected around the gates. What the hell happened out there? Sarah wondered aloud. The crystal formations responded by showing her scenes from across the galaxy. She watched news broadcasts in languages she didn't recognize, saw her own face on screens from the Krek's homeworld to the ethereal council chambers. Academic conferences had been called. Government sessions had been interrupted. The discovery of a human passing through the gates had become the biggest story in galactic history. "They're talking about me," Sarah realized with growing horror. "They think I'm some kind of legend." The chamber's response was what she was beginning to recognize as amused sympathy. The crystals showed her more scenes. Krek's generals studying human military history, ethereal philosophers analyzing human philosophy, Vorthon economists trying to understand human charity. Every major civilization in the galaxy was attempting to decode the secret of human legendary status. "But there is no secret," Sarah protested to the glowing crystals. "I'm just an archaeologist. I was taking mineral readings. I walked through your gates by accident." The crystals chimed in harmony that sounded distinctly like laughter. Outside the gates, the crowd had grown even larger. Sarah could see Dr. Martinez pacing frantically near their research camp, speaking rapidly into a communication device. Government representatives from every major power stood in heated discussion with the Deciphering keepers. News crews broadcast live coverage to billions of viewers across the galaxy. At the center of it all stood General Thrackmore, no longer wearing his ceremonial armor. Instead, he was dressed in simple robes similar to those worn by the temple keepers. The change was so striking that Sarah almost didn't recognize him. The crystal chamber showed her what had happened to the Krek's general over the past few days. After studying human culture and history, Thrackmore had experienced what his people called mind-breaking, a fundamental shift in worldview so profound that it changed his entire identity. He had resigned his military commission and requested permission to study at the temple. "I spent 40 years trying to become a legend," he was saying to a group of journalists, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller and more thoughtful. "I conquered star systems, commanded fleets, won battles that changed the course of history. But I was doing it all wrong. Humans don't try to become legends. They just are." Sarah watched in amazement as this warrior who had terrified entire sectors of space spoke about human firefighters and teachers and nurses as if they were the greatest heroes in galactic history. He described her grandmother Maria's wartime actions with the same reverence that military historians usually reserved for famous generals. "She didn't hide those families to become a legend," Thrackmore continued. "She hid them because they needed hiding. The legendary action was a side effect of being human." Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy. Ethereal philosophers were abandoning centuries-old meditation techniques to study human methods of learning through failure and doubt. Vorthon economists were analyzing human charity as if it were a revolutionary new financial instrument. But the most surprising changes were happening among humans themselves. As news of Sarah's achievement spread through human space, her species was beginning to see itself through alien eyes for the first time. They were learning that actions they considered normal were viewed by the rest of the galaxy as impossibly heroic. The crystal chamber showed Sarah footage from Earth, where crowds had gathered in cities around the world. But these weren't celebrations. They were more like moments of collective realization. Humans were discovering that their everyday acts of kindness and sacrifice were the stuff of galactic legend. A human news reporter on Earth was interviewing a retired teacher named Elena Rodriguez. "You taught in inner-city schools for 30 years, the reporter said. You bought supplies with your own money, stayed late to tutor struggling students, and never missed a day even when the school district couldn't pay your salary on time. Did you know that ethereal philosophers are calling you one of the great legendary figures of our time?" Elena, a small woman in her 70s with silver hair and tired eyes, looked genuinely confused. "I was just doing my job," she said. "Those kids needed someone to believe in them. What else was I supposed to do?" Sarah watched similar interviews playing out across human space. Firefighters, doctors, social workers, scientists, teachers, all of them struggling to understand why the galaxy suddenly considered their daily work to be legendary. They had been performing miracles so routinely that they had stopped noticing the miracles. "We really don't know, do we?" Sarah said to the crystal chamber. "We really don't understand what we are." The crystals pulsed with warm agreement. Humans were the only species in galactic history that had achieved universal legendary status, while remaining completely unaware of their achievement. Every human carried the potential for mythic action, not as a goal but as a natural response to need. The chamber began to pulse more urgently. Sarah looked up to see the star-filled ceiling changing again. The gates were preparing to open. Her time in this impossible space was coming to an end. "I guess I should go face the music," she said, gathering her equipment. "Though I have no idea what I'm going to tell all those people." The gates opened with the same crystalline song that had announced her arrival. Light poured into the chamber and Sarah could hear the roar of the crowd outside. She took a deep breath and walked toward the opening. The moment she emerged from the gates, chaos erupted. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Reporters shouted questions in a dozen languages. Government officials pushed forward with formal greetings and treaty proposals. The noise was overwhelming. Sarah stood in the gateway, blinking in the sudden brightness, still holding her scanner in one hand and a bag of mineral samples in the other. She looked exactly like what she was, a working scientist who had accidentally made the greatest discovery in galactic history. "Dr. Chen," shouted a reporter from the Galactic News Network. "How does it feel to be the first being in 3 centuries to pass through the gates of legend?" Sarah looked around at the massive crowd, the government delegations, the alien dignitaries hanging on her every word. She said. "Is anyone here from the geology department? Because I have some really interesting mineral samples that need analysis." The crowd fell silent. In that moment, watching this small human woman worry about rock samples while standing in the spotlight of galactic attention, every being present understood the truth that the gates had been trying to teach them. Legends weren't made by seeking legendary status. They were made by people who were too busy doing important work to notice they were becoming legendary. Dr. Martinez pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of relief and panic. "Sarah, thank God you're okay. Do you have any idea what's been happening? The entire galaxy is here." Sarah looked around at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, all waiting for her to reveal the secret of human legendary status. "Well," she said practically, "I hope someone brought coffee. And maybe we should set up a proper research station. These crystal formations are going to revolutionize our understanding of exotic matter physics." She paused, considering the crowd. "Also, I'm going to need a bigger team. This is definitely going to require a multidisciplinary approach." The galaxy held its breath, waiting for profound wisdom from their newly discovered legend. "Oh," Sarah added, almost as an afterthought, "and someone should probably call my mom. She worries when I'm late for dinner." General Thrackmore began to laugh, a deep rumbling sound that echoed across the temple complex. The laughter was contagious, spreading through the crowd as beings from across the galaxy finally understood the cosmic joke that had been hiding in plain sight. Humans were legendary precisely because they didn't try to be legendary. They were myths made manifest through the simple act of being themselves. And the greatest legend of all was that they had no idea how extraordinary they really were. As the sun set over the temple of Ketharan, Sarah Chen set up her equipment to begin the most important geological survey in galactic history,